Can a camera inspire? Can it have soul? Whenever I think of Leica cameras, I think of heritage, history. Every time I hold a Leica, it's as if I can feel the breadth and depth of humanity, wonderful and horrible, in my hands. I am awed by a photographic lineage wildly overrepresented among the world's greatest images captured over the last 94 years. Images that capture the zeitgeist. Images that, when you spend sufficient time with them, when you dig deeply enough into them, learn more about them, become perhaps the most accessible path to the past, the present, and maybe the future. Santayana was right. But I'm afraid Vonnegut was right too. It's why history holds me in such thrall, why photography is the particular lens through which I choose to study it, and why I've come to realize that in my personal work, I can see I want to prove him wrong. The view from the dawn of modern photography until now is relatively unobstructed, direct, rich with insights and connections to be mined if only we take the time to do so. Insights of which we should be mindful. Insights which should include the acknowledgement both of the power of imagery and the power that comes from manipulating and controlling the flow of imagery, especially in these times. Among photographers, there is precisely one man who stands above all others, a diminutive man, a humble man, a man who occupied a unique perch from which to view the sweep of history across almost 100 years. He usually had a Leica in his hand. Born in the 19th century, he lived through and bore witness to all but 5 years of the 20th. A soldier in the First World War, a button salesman immediately thereafter. A shutterbug who developed and printed his own work when photography was the high-tech industry, a refugee fleeing Nazi Germany just ahead of the Second World War because of his religion. All of 5'4", he was a giant, photographer to the stars, artists, writers, royalty, and the cream of society. Official photographer to multiple presidents, reviled photographer of fascists. Witness to, participant in cataclysmic events, and the glitter and allure of celebrity. Yet his most famous photograph is that of an unnamed sailor kissing an unnamed nurse in the middle of Times Square in New York City, August 14th, 1945, VJ Day, the end of World War II. His most harrowing photograph was taken just 4 months later in Hiroshima, a mother and her child surveying the place where their home once stood. Over the course of his career, he completed 2,500 assignments for. His photographs graced 90 covers of Life magazine. I'm talking, of course, about Alfred Eisenstaedt. How did he do that? I've just implied the answer. By being who he was, the sum total of his life's experiences up to the very point he tripped the shutter. As is the case for every single one of us, irrespective of where we are in our photographic journeys. And why Claudia and I drove down to Washington to see the recently opened exhibition of his work at the Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens. Hillwood is just one of the former homes of socialite Marjorie Merriweather Post, herself a subject of a 1965 Life magazine story photographed by Eisenstaedt. You might want to look very closely at her story. We saw our visit as an opportunity, if only obliquely, to step into his shoes, trace just some of his footsteps across the sands of time, and, thus fortified, garner new insights about our own time and ourselves. Eisenstaedt, Eisy, as his friends knew him, loved people. His empathy for his subjects was always manifest in his images, except in the rare instance when it was not. There is quite a story about his shoot with Hemingway. A nicer story about Sophia Loren. Eisy never lost his love for the art and process of photography. He retained until the very end his amateur spirit. Hold that thought. At the risk of oversimplification, these things, I think, are what made Eisenstaedt Eisenstaedt. But I encourage you to learn more about him and his work at your own pace. I'll put links to books and films that I think will help you in that journey down below. It's easy to forget that in the end, it's not about the gear, but about the people. Of course, Eisenstaedt was exactly right about that. But I think completely wrong, too. His humanity, skill, and eye notwithstanding, it was only when Eisenstaedt left behind the enormous 9 by 12 centimeter glass plate camera with which he first honed his skill as a professional, moved beyond the smaller but still ponderous 4.5 by 6 centimeter glass plate camera that allowed him to pursue low light work, and adopted the then revolutionary, small, simple little 35 millimeter film Leica cameras that he, along with other legendary photographers like Cartier-Bresson, ushered in a new era of photography based on speed and unobtrusiveness. The modern era. A camera like this one, handed down to me by my mother, who bought it secondhand from another German Jewish photographer who fled Nazi Germany, Hilda Hubbock. Several of her images are in the Getty collection in LA, but I knew Hilda, briefly, as a children's photographer in New York in the 1960s. In fact, she was our photographer. The camera Eisy used for his VJ Day photo, actually, was exactly like my mother's 3A because it was a 3A too, a camera he used to the very end. And later, he'd also use a camera like this one, the current object of my affection, the Leica M10-D. Which, okay, is just a little bit different than his film M3. If Leicas are not for everybody, and they're not, that's fine. The M10-D will appeal to even fewer people, I admit. I understand. In spirit, operation, and appearance, it is the digital M closest to Eisenstadt's film M3. In an era of hybrid cameras, the M10-D has no EVF, no video, no ports. It doesn't even have a rear screen. In fact, none of the M10 variants have video. None of them have ports. But the other two, the original full-frame 24-megapixel M10 and the newer M10-P, do have rear screens. All three offer gorgeous imagery straight out of camera. All are ideally matched, of course, to Leica's legendary M-mount glass. They all can take the optional Type 20 tiltable EVF, and they all are brilliantly and tightly coupled to Leica's Photos smartphone app. In the process from capture through edit to posting on social media, it is not unironic that every M10 is state-of-the-art. Now, to some people, the differences among these models are subtle. To others, they are dramatic. I'll cover these quickly right now. The M10-P is an M10 with a quieter shutter, a stealthier appearance, and a touchscreen. The red dot in front is replaced with a simple flathead screw, the signature Leica word mark engraved instead on the top plate. Like the Leica 3A, where it should be. The M10-P also has a built-in electronic level, useful when squaring up buildings in street work, for example, though hardly novel on its own in this day and age. The M10-D, well, think of it as an M10-P stripped of everything that would distance it from the shooting experience of the original film M, save for the electronics. As I said, this will not be everyone's cup of tea. But there are compensations. In place of the rear screen, you'll find a beautifully retro homage to the Film M's ASA dial. Today, a combination on-off Wi-Fi switch and exposure compensation control. Battery drain, as a result, is reduced. And in what I regarded for about the first minute or so, I saw it as utterly superfluous. Leica added a vestigial advance lever to the M10-D, which to my utter astonishment makes perfect sense and which I very much enjoy. It is an ideal thumb rest, that's all it does, freeing up the hot shoe for the Type 20 EVF, which I recommend irrespective of which M10 you buy. If this sounds counterintuitive to you, maybe even counterproductive, I understand that too. The good news is that we live in an era of extraordinarily wide choices and price points, and reasonable people may disagree on what's important. But for me, the combination of 21st century engineering and rapid workflow out to social media on the one hand, and mid-20th century DNA and deliberate workflow on the other, gives me the flexibility and joy to operate seamlessly, with intent, across both eras, film and digital, the purest and least compromised photographic experience in the current digital lineup. Right and wrong. Old and new, retro and state-of-the-art, slow and fast, expensive and, well, let's get into it in a bit more detail. I think we can handle it. Eisenstaedt loaded his 3A that day in Times Square with ASA 200 black and white film. He set the camera to 1/125th of a second, f8, pre-focused to 10 feet. He knew from the depth of field scale engraved on his lens that he had a margin of error of just about 6 feet altogether. Although by that point in his career, he didn't need the scale, he just knew it. Just as he already knew the field of view he wanted. When he saw out of the corner of one eye the white of a nurse's uniform, as he tells the story, he quickly whipped around and fired off 4 shots, knowing that this might be the moment he'd been waiting for. He'd been keeping a few feet ahead of a sailor he'd spied several blocks back, kissing every single woman he saw, irrespective of age, shape, size, or looks. A rangefinder slow? Sure, especially on this particular model, because there were separate windows for composing and focusing, and they were tiny. Except when a rangefinder isn't slow. Because when you zone focus, as he did, as most other street photographers did in that era, and some still do on occasion today, it is faster than the best autofocus out there. There is zero autofocus lag because there's no autofocus, I grant you. No hunting, no settling on the wrong thing and frantically trying to get the camera to focus on what it should. With the camera pre-focused and exposure predetermined, all of one's attention can be given to imagination, pre-visualization with room to riff, awareness of one's surroundings, openness to the moment, and composition. I really like that. Although, to be fair, Eisenstaedt did have this, the Vaio Universal Finder, which I can tell you is a heck of a lot nicer to use for framing an image. Kind of like the Type 20 EVF is, at least for some of us. Easier to focus, the Type 20, too, especially when you're shooting wide open with longer lenses. Though, sure, a rangefinder camera is still not the optimal choice for shooting fast-moving sports, twirling models with lenses set to eyelash deep depth of field, or long telephotos. In fact, all it takes is a 50mm lens, a fast one, to intrude into the field of view of the optical finder. Fair enough. Even IZ occasionally used a single lens reflex. Let's talk value. Leicas are expensive. Yeah, that's what small volume, super high quality, hand-assembled, individually tested gear that have stood the test of time costs to stay in business. I don't begrudge Leica its pricing. Yet these are some of the same reasons Leicas can be extraordinary investments too. For those who have the budget and inclination, no other modern camera system holds its value better. They are built to last a lifetime and often do several times over. No other manufacturer has such an extraordinary heritage, so clearly imbued in each and every individual hand-assembled camera or lens. Speaking of which, all of Leica's M-mount lenses are absolutely tiny and beautifully built, jewel-like, silky smooth, industrial art, optically superb. They are manual focus only with hard stops, engraved depth of field scale and distance markings on the barrel, and dedicated aperture rings. I much prefer the reduced silhouette and weight of a small mirrorless full-frame body with a single small fast prime mounted to it, over the kind of kit I used to carry most often, a DSLR with either a 24-70 or 70-200 2.8 or f4 zoom. But how do last century lens designs hold up in an era of megapixel madness? Well, more to come on that in future videos. But for now, I can tell you that the oldest optical design in the current Leica M line's catalog is that of my 5th generation 50mm Summicron-M dating back to 1979. But even that can give you this. I know of no other interchangeable lens full-frame mirrorless camera system less obtrusive or delightful in the hand. Or, up to the eye. I much prefer the rangefinder style body given my right eye and central proboscis dominance. Of course, your mileage may vary and that's fine. Beyond all of this, there is something incredibly satisfying about stepping off the annual, even quarterly tech-chasing merry-go-round, forgetting about megapixel this, autofocus points that, and just picking your spot, framing your shot, settling in, waiting, scanning. Maybe, instead of a spinning model, you are the one suddenly spinning around, this time in response to a flash of white at your periphery, firing off a shot or four, and knowing, just knowing, you got it. An image for the ages. Look, I make no pretense to objectivity when it comes to Leicas, especially given my own personal history with the brand, dating back to my first days on this mortal coil. And I am fully cognizant of the fact that, as with all forms of art, it is ultimately what one chooses to see in it, rather than the object itself, that defines one's interaction with and sense of worth of it. Does a camera have soul? Well, I grapple with that very concept, but it comforts me. In the end, to paraphrase Hemingway in another context, it's certainly pretty to think so. No matter. What is unequivocal is that these Leicas inspire me like no other. For me, they are talismans, as they might be, or already are, for you too. Especially if street photography, photojournalism, or combat photography is your thing, even now. But talisman or not, whether you know Eisenstaedt or not, whether you are a professional or not, have the budget and inclination or not, irrespective of your shooting style or choice of gear, I want to leave you with a few quotes that I hope resonate with you, even a fraction of how much they resonate with me. Thanks for watching. It has been my joy to share these musings with you.